Howdy, friends, and welcome to the Wild Vaughn Manor. Yes, it's the Wild Vaughn Manor today because we're just about at June and June on the Range. That's right, June on the Range, a whole month devoted to reading Western fiction. So it's time to kick off June on the Range and to give you some ideas for what to read. I came up with a top 10 list of my favorite Western authors. Are these the greatest Western authors? Maybe, but maybe not. So I came up with my top 10 favorite Western authors. A bunch of dead guys who wrote a whole bunch of Western books. Now they're my favorites mostly because these are the Western authors that, for the most part, I grew up reading. My grandfather read a lot of Westerns. There were always a lot of Westerns lying around when I was younger, because back in those days when I was growing up, it was at the tail end of the Western genre being really popular. Western genre was really popular all the way up through the 1970s, and then it pretty much died out by the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s. Of course, Westerns still existed, and they still exist. There are, of course, still Westerns being written today, but it's not like it was. There used to be a ton of Westerns available everywhere all the time. And so when I was growing up, there were a lot of Westerns that were just lying around. If you went to a used bookstore back in the 80s or even the 90s, there were just piles of used Westerns. There was always a Western section in the used bookstores. Not so much anymore. Depending on where you go, sometimes there are, but it wasn't like it was, man. So these Western writers that I'm going to be talking about today, they're the Western writers I pretty much grew up reading. And that's why they're my favorite. Most of them wrote tons and tons of books because back in the 50s and 60s, man, they would just pump these out as paperback originals for the most part. So yeah, let's talk about my 10 favorite Western writers, going from 10 to 1, like we do in this sort of list. And most of these Western writers that I'm going to be talking about are available as ebooks. So if you've got a Kindle, you can actually read these authors' books. You don't have to scour the used book sections to find them. Most of these are available as ebooks, these authors' works. So the first author I'm going to be talking about, number 10, is Elmer Kelton. Elmer Kelton, who was born in 1926. I got myself some notes here. He was born in 1926, died in 2009. Elmer Kelton wrote a bunch of Westerns of high quality. This guy wrote good stuff. He was a multiple Spur Award winner. Spur Award, that's the Western Fiction Award. Multiple Spur Award winner and the famed editor of Sheep and Goat Raiser magazine, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But he also wrote books, a whole ton of them. Elmer Kelton, I like his books a lot. I've read a lot of this guy's books. I haven't read all of them, but he wrote a lot of books, Elmer Kelton. And this one is The Far Canyon. So yeah, Elmer Kelton, that's number 10. What's number 9? Number 9 would be Will Henry. Will Henry. This is Medicine Road with the new easy-to-read print. This is one of those old leisure westerns which catered to the senior citizens. When these were printed, most Western readers were senior citizens. So this is Will Henry. He was born in 1912. He passed away in 1991. And he wrote, again, another guy who wrote a ton of Westerns. He was also a screenwriter for MGM, I believe. But yeah, he was one of those Western writers who wrote a ton of Westerns, and they're pretty good. They're pretty darn good. He wrote short stories. He wrote a bunch of novels. Will Henry. Check him out. He was good. I like Will Henry. He's number 9. Which brings me to number 8. Roy Hogan. Roy Hogan, who was born in 1908, passed away in 1998. Roy Hogan, I mean, this guy, like most of these writers I'm going to talk about, just wrote so many books. And he was probably most well known, for these books, the Shawn Starbuck Westerns. The Shawn Starbuck series. This is a double, which has the first 2 Shawn Starbuck Westerns. And he also did the Doomsday Marshal series. I've got a couple of those up at the Rustic Vaughn Lodge waiting for me, the Doomsday Marshal. But aside from those series books, he also had just a ton of books. So many books. And he was really good. His books are full of action. They're just kind of the classic Western style stories. Great stuff. Roy Hogan. Roy Hogan. So there you go. Now, number 7 is Nelson C. Nye. Nelson C. Nye, who was born in 1907, died in 1997. He was a critic. He was an editor for a livestock magazine, I think. I could be wrong. Or maybe no, it was, he was into horses, so it could have been a horse magazine. I don't know. But I know he wrote a lot of Westerns. A ton of them. Like I said, this is one of these guys who just pumped them out. And this is one of them that I have not read yet. And I'm going to be reading this month for June on the Range. This is Born to Trouble with this great cover. Now you see most of these Westerns are not particularly long. A lot of these Westerns that were produced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were just short, straight to the point action stories. And so, you know, if you write this sort of thing, you can kind of pump them out. And that's what this guy did. Like so many of these other writers. Born to Trouble. Just good, classic Western fun. Excellent writer. This next author, number 6, you might have heard of this one. And I'm putting him up here even though I've only read a couple Westerns by this writer. This being one of them, The Memoirs of Wild Bill Hickok. This is Richard Matheson. Now, Richard Matheson, I had to put in here because the Westerns I read were really good. He did this, he did Journal of the Gun Years, he did another few Westerns, one of which I'll be reading for June on the Range. But, of course, this author, who was born in 1926 and passed away only in 2013, is most famous for his fantasy, science fiction, and horror writings. He did Hell House. He did The Shrinking Man. Most famously, he did I Am Legend. He did a bunch of scripts for The Twilight Zone. Tremendously influential writer. But he also wrote Westerns. And in the 90s, he kind of went through a phase where that's what he wrote, was Westerns. So, had to throw in Richard Matheson, just because he is such a great writer. Richard Matheson. Now we've got to go to one of the most famous Western writers of all time. And that would be Zane Grey, who was born in 1872, died in 1939, produced a ton of Westerns. Also wrote baseball novels. You won't find so many baseball novels from this guy still in print, but you can find them as ebooks if you're interested. Most of this author's writings you could find as ebooks. A lot of them, since he wrote so long ago, are available in the public domain, so, you know, they're free. Zane Grey. Really good action Western writer. Have to mention, and I probably should say this about Westerns in general, they do not have occasionally, they did not have the most sensitive portrayals of folks that weren't white. And Zane Grey is probably the worst on this list as far as that goes. You will find racial slurs, insensitive portrayals, unrealistic portrayals, stereotypical portrayals, not just of Native Americans, but of other characters who, you know, aren't white. And that is a little off-putting when you read this guy's stuff now. And you could read this stuff and it's like a great book, and then you'll get to something like that and you'll be like, whoa, you know, and it'll kind of set you back a bit. It's unfortunate. But as awful and prevalent as racism and stereotyping other people is now, it was even worse back in the day. And I guess it's a good thing that that kind of thing will startle you and shock you sometimes when you read these old-timey books. I guess we've progressed somewhat. We've still got an awful long way to go. But yeah, know that when you're reading Zane Grey. His portrayal of people who, like I said, aren't white, and sometimes just other groups of people, can be a little off-putting and sometimes shocking. So yeah, know that going in. And know that going in when you're reading Westerns, unfortunately, especially these old-timey ones. You'll find stuff like that. But as Westerns, they really hold up. Zane Grey was talented at writing what he was interested in writing about. And he is a foundational figure in the Western genre. Can't really ignore Zane Grey. And he was awful good. He was good at what he did. That's for sure. So yeah, that was Zane Grey. Let's go to number 4 now. And number 4 for me is Luke Short. Luke Short, this is Bounty Guns. This is a book I haven't read from Luke Short, so I'll be reading this for June on the Range. Luke Short was born in 1908 and he died in 1975. He didn't live long enough, this guy. Talented man, wrote a bunch of Westerns. He was at one time an archaeologist's assistant, and I guess he thought, you know, heck with this dusty old job. I'm going to write Westerns. And so he did, and he was a big success at it. Wrote a ton of books like all these other guys. Probably didn't write as many as some of these other guys, but he wrote a lot of books. And they're all really, really good. Again, like I said, you could find this guy's work as ebooks if you're interested. Good, solid, traditional action-adventure type Westerns. Highly recommend Luke Short. He's one of my favorites. I like this guy's stuff. Now we're moving on to number 3. Wayne D. Overholser. Born in 1906, died in 1996. This guy wrote a ton of Westerns. Powerful Westerns with excellent characters, good plots. They had an edge to them, some of Wayne D. Overholser's books. And they're awful good. They're awful good. This one's Buckskin Man, which is one I actually have not read, so I'm looking forward to reading this one. I mean, a lot of these authors, they wrote so many books that, yeah, as many books as I've read from these guys, I'm always coming across books I haven't read from these guys. And I'm very happy I created June on the Range to give me an excuse to read some of these books I haven't read, because I haven't read too many Westerns in a while. I used to read a bunch of them growing up and as a younger man. I just read a ton of Westerns, including a ton from this guy, my grandfather's favorite writer of all time. This is number 2 for me. This is Louis L'Amour. You knew Louis L'Amour had to come in here somewhere. Louis L'Amour, born in 1908, died in 1988. One of the most, well, he is the most famous Western writer of all time. He's the best-selling Western writer of all time. He's one of the best-selling writers of all time, I think. Again, wrote a ton of books, this guy, Louis L'Amour, and just tremendously popular. And it's understandable, because this guy's books just roll, man, when you're reading them. They just have tremendous forward momentum, a lot of action. He had a decent handle on his characters, just fun stuff. Pulpy stuff. But that is, you know, that could be a good thing. And in this case, it's a good thing. I like Louis L'Amour an awful lot. He wrote a lot of short fiction, which was really good. Most of his novels are really good. He wrote the Sackett series, his famous Sackett series of books. Excellent series of books, a lot of fun. He's a lot of fun, this guy. And he wrote some other stuff, historical fiction. I think his last book was actually kind of a science fiction-y type of thing. Haunted Mesa, I think that was his last book. But Yeah, ton of Westerns. Very famous. Louis L'Amour. Excellent stuff, Louis L'Amour. But he's not my number one. Who is my number one? Who could it be if it's not Louis L'Amour? T.V. Olsen. Number one for me is T.V. Olsen. Born in 1932, died in 1993. Another fellow who didn't live long enough. T.V. Olsen. I first came across a T.V. Olsen book in an airport. Where the heck was I going? I don't remember where I was going, but I was in an airport. Didn't have anything to read, so I picked up one of these leisure books that were reprinting T.V. Olsen's books. I think it was a double. And I was just riveted. I mean, this guy writes good Westerns. And he has an excellent handle on character. In fact, he focuses on character, which is one of the things that makes these stand out so well. His excellent characterizations, really good plots. Another author that had an edge to him when he wrote his stories. So he wrote traditional Westerns. He just did it in his own way, and they were really, really good. And he, like a lot of these guys, T.V. Olsen's books, a few of them were filmed to great success. Good stuff, T.V. Olsen, and I really highly, highly recommend this guy. He's one of those authors that just wrote a ton of books. You used to see his stuff all the time, but like a lot of Western writers, he's kind of been forgotten, and that's really unjust, particularly in T.V. Olsen's case, because his stuff is mighty good. So that was number one for June on the Range. I hope you join me for June on the Range. Try out some of these authors that I have suggested, and I will see you on the range. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.